Shalom and welcome once again to Pearls of the Torah. I'm Moreh Matan, Pastor Matt McEwen, and I'm so glad to be back with you once again as we are in a new Torah portion this week, the Torah portion of Noach. And it's an exciting Torah portion, and so I'm anxious to get into it with you. As we started last week in Parashat Bereshit, we are going through this entire Torah cycle, looking at our good friend the Or HaChaim and his commentary on the Torah. So I'm so glad that you are with us again. Once again, I want to remind you that if you have not done so already, please subscribe to this channel and please share this video on your social media so that as many people as possible can benefit from this teaching. It's always a pleasure to get together with you every week as we delve into these pearls of the Torah. So this week in Parashat Noach, there are a couple of things that we are going to look at. First of all, we're going to explore divine judgment and the covenant of renewal. And please bear with me one more week. I hope I'm getting over this. I've still got a bit of a head cold, and you can hear it in my voice. So I'm just still a bit under the weather. So thank you for your prayers. We're going to look at divine judgment and the covenant of renewal. Of course, we have Noah himself and his family. We're going to look at the ark as a sanctuary, the covenant and the sign of the rainbow, the fall of humanity with regard to the Tower of Babel or Babel, Migdal Bavel, and we're also going to look at some practical takeaways from this week's Torah portion. So let's get into this. First of all, our scripture address, if you will, this week is Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, and then going to chapter 11, verse 32. And some of the themes that we have in this week's Torah portion are righteousness, divine judgment, of course, covenant, renewal, and obedience. And the purpose, I think, of us going through this particular study with the Or HaChaim is to understand God's judgment on a corrupt world and his covenant to renew and restore creation through Noah. Now, it is interesting that as we were last year around this time during this Torah portion, we were shortly after the October 7th massacre in Israel, and it was interesting to us that at the beginning of that chapter, it says that the earth is filled with violence at the beginning of this Torah portion. And of course, we know that in Hebrew, the word for violence is Hamas, that the earth was filled with Hamas. And because of that, God had to deal with it in a judgmental way. He had to bring his divine judgment to bear on the world. I will never read this Torah portion the same again. We have always known that this word Hamas means violence, but it just rings differently in my ears ever since the events of October 7th. So I feel like every year as we go through this Torah portion, whenever I read that word, it's going to feel a bit different. So let's first look at the righteousness of Noah. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, it says that Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Now, it also says when Noah was born that God showed his parents grace or favor. The word for grace, of course, in Noah is chen, or in Hebrew, the word for grace is chen. And it is interesting, we like to point this out, that if you simply flip the letters of Noach, you flip that, you get the word for grace. So, as he was a righteous man and blameless among the people of his time, he walked faithfully with God. There are questions that arise in various commentaries and with various rabbis and members of Chazal, the sages of blessed memory. The Or HaChaim specifically observes that Noah, in his righteousness, that his righteousness is emphasized within a corrupt generation where he lived. And he stood out as, it calls him tamim, or blameless. Now, it is interesting that when we look at Yaakov, our father Jacob, He is also known as an ish tam, a blameless man, a righteous man. So Noah is known as righteous, but he's also known as blameless, innocent, that he is tamim. Now this righteousness is not only relative to his generation, but it reflects a unique commitment to God amidst adversity and amidst a corrupt people, amidst a corrupt time. All of creation was corrupt. When it says that all of creation and all the world was filled with Hamas, was filled with violence, it was violent. It was there was robbery. There were even awful, immoral things that were happening not only between humans, but even in the animal kingdom. It was a terrible, terrible time. And God had to remake everything. He had to sort of tear it all down and start again with Noah and his family. Now, as we look at this, there are certain rabbis, Rashi, the Rambam, the Ramban, and others, of course, the Or HaChaim here. There are many rabbis that will ask a difficult question. I enjoy this about Judaism, that difficult questions can be asked. And as long as we ask them with respect, I think there's nothing wrong with asking difficult questions. One of the difficult questions that it might seem uncomfortable for us to ask, but the rabbis ask it, and that is, if Noah was so righteous in his generation, would he have been considered righteous if he lived in another generation? One of the most famous rabbis asks, if Noah was in Abraham's generation, would he have been considered righteous? He was righteous in his generation, meaning that the time he lived in was so evil, was so corrupt, that he stood out from among the crowd. Would his righteousness have measured up against our father Abraham's? Well, that's a good question. Perhaps not. But this idea of him being blameless and being righteous, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was perfect. Remember, we can live in a state of blamelessness if we are right with God, if we have repented for the things that we have done wrong. So let's ask ourselves some difficult questions. How does living among a corrupt society impact personal righteousness? Do we still hold ourselves to a biblical standard, or do we say, well, our righteousness is relative to the times in which we live? I think the Torah has to be our measuring stick. I think the Torah has to be the standard by which we are measured, and we measure everyone, and we measure each of the generations. I think that is something that is concrete. That is something that is static. That's something that doesn't change. We may seem relatively righteous compared to a wicked generation that we're living in, but does that mean that we are very righteous at all? I think this is a difficult question that we must ask ourselves. I think it's also important that we mention what Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, says in the Brit Chadashah, which is, if we say that when sin increases, grace increases, should we just sin all the more so that grace will increase? Chas v'chalila, God forbid. Certainly not. We don't want to look at it that way. We need to be righteous according to God's standards, not according to the standard of our generation. Now, here's another difficult question. Can the concept of being righteous in one's generation suggest that God's standards adapt to a human context? I think there are some in this world that will subscribe to a view of moral relativism. This is not the ways of the Torah. This is not how God intends for us to live. We're not supposed to have our morality based on a sliding scale. This is why I say I think we should base this on the Torah, which is static, which is steady, which is sure. Remember, Yeshua said himself, we need to build our house on the solid rock and not on the sinking sand. Let's look at this next concept, the idea of the ark as a sanctuary. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, it says, make yourself an ark out of cypress wood make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. Now, interestingly enough, it is in this modern translation as cypress wood, but in other translations you may read gopher wood. Now, it is important that we understand that this isn't referring to, in the English language, an animal called a gopher. It just so happens that there is an animal in the English language called a gopher. But this word, gopher wood, is actually a transliteration of a Hebrew word, and this word is gopher. We didn't really know how to translate it, and so we simply transliterated it. We simply used English characters to spell out the sounds of this Hebrew word gopher. Now, this is a word that has connotations of judgment associated with it. In the Bible, when we talk about judgment, sometimes we have these pictures of sulfur and fire raining from the sky, judgment. We're talking about, epic language here. But that's what's going on here in this narrative of the ark. It is an epic judgment of God. The flood is a terrible thing that had to happen. It is appropriate that when we're talking about the flood with children, we talk about the big boat and all the animals and all that stuff, because that's what children like to hear. Those are age-appropriate ways to tell the story of Noah and the ark. We don't teach children about millions of people dying and drowning and other animals and all of creation being destroyed and remade. We don't talk about those things. But when we look at the flood, it absolutely is a story of judgment, of God's divine judgment and retribution against a rebellious creation. And so we can't ignore that, even though it makes us uncomfortable, even though it's difficult to think about and to talk about. We can't ignore it. We've got to be honest with the text and look at difficult passages like this. So when we have this idea of gopher wood, or this word gopher, the connotation there in the Hebrew is that of judgment. Why? It is because this is part of God's judgment that is happening. And it is the ark that is the vehicle through which that Noah and his family are going to be saved through this judgment, along with the animals, of course, that are on the ark. Now, the Or HaChaim says this. He interprets the construction of the ark as a divine invitation to safety within the physical ark, but also within the spiritual confines of God's provision. The ark is seen as like a sanctuary, like a safe place, not just a vessel. By following God's instructions exactly, Noah made the ark a place of holiness that preserved life. Now, think about this. Are there modern day arks, if you will, sanctuaries that we have, that we find protection and spiritual renewal? I think in my life, I could say a resounding yes to that. I think it's important that we understand that all of us need these sanctuary type places, whether they are physical sanctuaries, like in our congregations, or if they're sanctuaries that are more virtual, like this video, like the teachings that you receive from our ministry, like the Ahavat Ami virtual synagogue, like services that you could participate in from Beit Shuvu Africa or other ministries that we have across the world. These are sanctuaries, places of protection and spiritual renewal that are not physical, but more virtual and technological. We can gather together using technology and find these spaces where holiness is found, protection is found, where a sanctuary is found. Now, I want you to consider something. Consider how you can build, if you will, arks, these sanctuaries of faith, obedience, community, places of refuge in challenging times. I know within our ministry and within our yeshiva, a family has developed. And we find that protection and provision, that brother and sisterhood, we find that familial type atmosphere inside our school, inside our ministry, inside our yeshiva. And you are a part of that. Even if you're not within our yeshiva, you obviously are partaking in the video content that we have, the teaching that we have for you, and we hope that you do appreciate it and use it. Don't take it for granted. It takes quite a lot of resources to do this type of ministry. So continue to share and continue to help support these areas of ministry as they become like an ark of faith and obedience and community for you and your family. Let's look at God's covenant and the sign of the rainbow. In Genesis 9:13, it says, "I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth." The Orach Chaim discusses that the rainbow is not only a sign of God's promise never to destroy the earth by flood again, but also it serves as a reminder of God's patience and mercy. The rainbow's appearance during rainfall acts as a visual representation of God's mercy overshadowing judgment. Now, when I was a child, I never really thought much of bow. I never looked at that word, rainbow. I have never been much into archery. I mean, when I was a child and would go to summer camp, we might have a bow and some arrows or things like that. But when I think of the word bow in English, I don't necessarily think of archery, of a bow and arrows. But that's part of the origin of this English word, about the rainbow. And it was explained to me by a rabbi a number of years ago that I thought this explanation was quite beautiful. And I've used it before, so if you've heard it before, this will be a repetition and a renewal for you. But if you've never heard this before, perhaps this will be a blessing to you. When you pull back the arrow on a bow, the wooden part of the bow bends in the direction that the arrow is going to fly. So if I were to be looking at a bow and someone pulling back that bow, the wood bends in the direction that the arrow will go. Now that's interesting. The way that the rainbow bends, it is bent away from the earth, as if the arrow, if you will, or God's judgment in this particular area is pointed away from the earth. Now, I thought that was a wonderful object lesson and a way to remember the bow part of the rainbow. I think that's a very interesting thing, and maybe a good lesson for you to teach your children or grandchildren as you see a rainbow in the sky. And by the way, after you watch this lesson, perhaps it would be a good idea for you to look up the special blessing that is said in Judaism every time one sees a rainbow. There's a blessing for everything in Judaism. Now, what does the rainbow symbolize about God's nature? And how does this covenant reveal God's balance between justice and mercy? Remember, justice and mercy are things that the Lord wants us to have as well. They're not just characteristics that He possesses, but it's something that He wants us to have, justice and mercy, for our judgment to be tempered with grace, with mercy. In what ways does the knowledge of God's enduring covenant with humanity provide hope and direction today? Doesn't that show the faithfulness of our God? Because we have not kept our end of the covenant. We haven't. And in today's world, when the rainbow has been co-opted to be used as a symbol for things other than God's enduring covenant, we see that His faithfulness still stands strong, even when we are unfaithful. His covenant stands. His end of the bargain, so to speak, is still standing. The failings of humanity. Let's look at Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, or the Tower of Babel. In Genesis 11:4, it says, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves." Wow. Look at the purpose to make a name for themselves. It needs to be our job as bearers of God's name and of his character, imitators of God. It needs to be our job to make a great name for him in the world, not for ourselves. Now, the Or HaChaim says that the Tower of Babel reflects a unified human ambition that seeks to assert independence from God. The people's desire to make a name for themselves represents the dangers of pride and the abandonment of divine purpose. Their attempt to rise to the heavens is a misdirected effort to reach God on their own terms. Think about this. How does the story of Babel compare to the ark in Noah's story? What are the contrasting motivations of the people in each scenario? You know, it's interesting that people, their thoughts were only evil all the time. And God had to do something. Something had to be done. He had to start over. These people wanted to make a name for themselves. They were prideful. Consider where pride may be at work in personal or community life, and discuss ways to redirect ambitions towards service to God rather than self-promotion. Isn't it interesting that the movement, the rainbow these days, it is called a pride movement? I think that's interesting. I think that's something that we need to take notice of. I think humility needs to be much more a part of our lives than pride. Some practical takeaways. Let's look at the concept of righteousness in a corrupt world. Noah's example calls us to live counterculturally, embracing righteousness and commitment to God, even when the world's standards seem compromised. I was talking with a leader of a congregation just this week about the 1960s and how if I lived in those days, I probably would not have a beard if I was leading a congregation. Because in those days, having facial hair was looked at as a counterculture symbol. It was looked at as being a bit rebellious. Isn't that interesting? How things change. Now, the main reason I have a beard today is it's part of Jewish tradition. It's just a tradition for people who are in the Jewish world to have beards, for men to have beards. It's one of the things that separates us from women, from females, is the ability to grow a beard. It's probably apocryphal, but there is a quote from a famous theologian that supposedly one time said that God gave men beards to make them beautiful. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, and I don't know if it's better for me to cover up more of my face or not, but it's just interesting about this idea of living counter to the culture. That was looked at as a negative thing in the 1960s and in the 1970s. But today, our culture has become so opposite from what God has intended that sometimes it means if we're going to live a godly life, we need to live counter to the culture. That's an interesting thing for us to remember. We need to embrace righteousness and commitment to God even when the world's standards seem compromised. Here's another practical takeaway of this week's Torah portion. God as a covenant keeper. The covenant with Noah reminds us of God's faithfulness and invites us into a relationship based on trust in his promises. God can be trusted because he is the great covenant keeper, even when we are very good at breaking the covenant. And also lessons in pride as a practical takeaway. The Babel account warns against prideful ambition and encourages humility and dependence on God's guidance. Don't try to make a name for yourself. Let us make God's name great in the world. Now, in conclusion, I think it's appropriate for us to ask the Lord to strengthen us in our righteousness and in our resolve to keep his promises, to keep his word, and to follow his teachings. To ask him to help us build sanctuaries of faith, not just physical ones, not just churches and synagogues, but for us to have sanctuaries of time sanctuaries of virtual space for us to be able to be with one another online, for instance. And we need to also pray that he give us the strength and the faith to rely on his covenant promises as he guides us through life's challenges. Because whether it is a group of people trying to make a name for themselves, to make themselves famous, or if it is God's judgment coming upon the world, if we are on the right side, if we are on the Lord's side, we have nothing to worry about. He is faithful to his covenant promises, and so we are going to be safe within his plan. We don't have anything to worry about. The worst thing that could happen to us is that we could lose our life. And as the scripture says, to die for the believer is simply gain. I may lose this physical body, but there is a time coming when the Lord will return and there will be a resurrection of the dead, and our body will be remade incorruptible so that it will never die or become ill again. Joining me this week for Pearls of the Torah. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you again for sharing and subscribing, and tune in next week as we get into our next Torah portion. It's been my pleasure to be with you. Once again, I'm Moreh Matan, Pastor Matt with Ahavat Ami International. Shalom and Kol Tuv.